You have to get really good at taking in a lot of data, figuring out what's relevant, what's not, and then being prepared to move, knowing full well that everything that you do at that moment in time is still going to make its way into the light. And maybe you'll feel good about the actions that you and your team and others took, or maybe you'll wish you had done something differently.
This is a Security Weekly production. Security Weekly is a resource of Cyber Risk Alliance.
The Cybersecurity Collaborative, in conjunction with Cyber Reason, is proud to present CISO Stories. Each week, CISO Stories takes a deep dive on security leadership. The Cybersecurity Collaborative is a unique membership community enabling cybersecurity leaders to work together in a trusted environment. To learn more, visit securityweekly.com/CSC. I'm your host, Todd Fitzgerald, and this week we welcome Renee Gutman-Stark, former CISO at Time Warner, Coca-Cola, Royal Caribbean, and Campbell's Soup.
Todd, thanks for having me. I'd like to be consistent because I think I've told this story before. I was actually working for Glaxo Wellcome in Raleigh, North Carolina in 1994, and we were going through a merger. And I was responsible for email systems and office automation. Well, back in that day, it was pre-1994, and that's a significant event because that's actually when some of the first people used the internet for some commercial activity. But prior to that, the only people that were really on the internet were government, pharmaceutical research firms. And so as a result of my owning email, I actually was responsible for the firewalls and other systems that were in place at the time, including we had antivirus, we even had secure ID, fobs. Well, I wound up not getting my job as a result of the merger, and I walked across the hallway and I opened the door to the security department. I asked them if they had any openings, and they did. And so I've never looked back. I mean, that was 27 years ago, roughly. And it's been an honor and a privilege to be in the information security industry, to watch it evolve and to really help influence, some of the things that, have shaped the security industry. Because I was an early adopter of things like OWASP and I was, everybody's second or third client. So it's been a thrill to be part of this industry, and I've just never wanted to do anything else.
I mean, you've really had the opportunity to see this industry grow. And as we look at every organization having a CISO today, you've been right there in understanding what this job of a CISO really is about.
I think that's true. I mean, I know that Steve Katz had the title. I don't remember what year he got it, but that was a big deal, and really, we went from, honestly, we used to talk about security and people wouldn't know what we were talking about. They didn't want to know what we were talking about. And it was the equivalent of witchcraft for the most part. But now, you've got thousands and thousands and millions of people in the industry. You've got hundreds of products. Like I said, when I first started, we had antivirus, firewalls, and we had secure ID. I remember putting in a PKI, but we had 4 products or something like that we were picking and choosing from. And so, not only has the role evolved, but just the complexity of the space and the amount of products, processes. I mean, it's like being a brain surgeon to a certain degree, although I've never been a brain surgeon.
So I really like your article, and it goes back into some of those early days with Steve Katz became the first CISO in 1995, and you were back in that time as well. And I really liked your article that you wrote for CISO Compass, Navigating Cybersecurity Leadership Challenges with Insights from Pioneers, which you were clearly one of those pioneers. And you wrote an article called The 6-Minute Rule. And I found that to be very fascinating. And you started talking about how this really predated the compliance, all the regulations when you were first working at Time Magazine. Could you walk us through the piece that you wrote?
So I wrote the 6-minute rule, and Todd, for people that know me, they actually know that I'm full of what I call these Reneeisms, or these principles that I operate by. And one of them happens to be the 6-minute rule. So when I start a new job, I actually print the list and I share it with my team, and I say, look, there's a lot of things that make me tick, and these are 7 of them, or something like that. But the 6-minute rule is really about the fact that, you don't always have a guide. You don't always have something, a regulation or a PCI or a this or that, or a best practice, or something to go from, but yet you're expected to make a decision. And that decision could be anywhere from, do you allow a system to launch, like the parenting system that I spoke about? I mean, they were one of the first to want to put, your sonograms on a website and allow you to give access to those pictures to other parties. And we were talking about, were there any privacy consequences as a result of that particular situation? But the business wanted to move forward, and my job was not to stop them. All right, it wasn't to say no. It wasn't even to say not now. I have another principle, which is, how do you know when you'll know enough? And the answer is sometimes that could be never. So you have to sort of get a set of criteria that enable you to move forward. And that may be something that you can prepare for. If you're doing a project, you can figure out what the criteria is so that you can move forward, or it may be during a breach. But at the end of the day, and a breach is slightly different. I'll talk about that in a second. But at the end of the day, we're in a position now. Remember, I talked about the fact that nobody knew what we did. They didn't want to know what we did in 1993. Now everybody's a backseat driver, and everybody will look at what you did. They'll dissect it. And I grew up with the 6-minute rule because I worked alongside journalists at Time Inc. And I knew that no matter what happened, that they were going to investigate. There was no, idea that, there was a separation, right? So what the right hand was doing would never be found out by the left hand. Well, it didn't work like that. So we knew that whatever we did would eventually find its way into the sun, into the light. And so we really, thought through, and we developed even things like, well, how do you title a message? You don't title something that's a security event, with subcapitals, security breach, so you get much more disciplined and careful. I think, knowing that whatever you're doing now, there's probably somebody that's going to dissect it and dissect not only what you do, but the actions of your team. They'll question how well you've trained the law department, how well you've prepared corporate communication. So I think there's a lot of work to be done to get ready for, being able to think on your feet. And I think that's what it comes down to. You have to get really good at taking in a lot of data, figuring out what's relevant, what's not, and then being prepared to move, knowing full well that everything that you do at that moment in time is still going to make its way into the light. And maybe you'll feel good about the actions that you and your team and others took, or maybe you'll wish you had done something differently. But at the end of the day, we just have to understand that everything we're doing now will eventually see the light. And I think that's okay.
And how do you know when you have enough information? Because I really like what you say there, because it really is the essence of leadership, being able to act on limited information. And sometimes in this industry, I think we can get into an analysis paralysis, or until we have all the complete information. So how do you get to that point where you can make a decision that's going to stand up later?
I want to say a little bit of it depends, right? So if you're working on a project, right, you can do a little bit more about what are the risks. how important is the system? What kind of data? How is important is it to the operations? What do I need to make a good decision? If I'm bringing in a product, do I want to understand things like the vendor? Is the vendor likely to succeed? Are they likely to be around in a year from now? Does the product work? Does it scale? What does change management look like? So you can actually define criteria. The thing is, you've actually got to define the criteria. Because I've been in a situation, Todd, where I've given my team a project and said, go define the requirements, get the stakeholders, get the team, and then they come back and they've done all their testing and they hand me the two solutions and they say, we don't know which one we would recommend. And that's not good, okay? I mean, at the end of the day, come up with a criteria, and then that's your how will you know when you know enough moment, right? So it's really important that somebody be in a position to make a decision, right? So if your team comes to you and says, listen, I've got two products, you make the decision. At the end of the day, a decision you wouldn't be in the project in the first place if there was not an opportunity to make a decision of some sort. And the reason why a decision has to be made is because if nobody makes a decision, it's likely that everybody will make a decision and you'll end up putting 10 little boats into the water, and you won't have a solid direction. You'll have people running off in different directions, doing what they think might be best in the situation. Same goes for a breach. If no one's calling the shots and you've got everybody doing everything that they think might be the right thing and you've got nothing being organized. So there has to be a decision being made most of the time. And some of it comes from experience, Todd. I don't say that experience doesn't play a role, but it's about having the right people involved. And I believe that sometimes when you get into an incident, you struggle with a concept called need to know when you don't have the right people at the table. So I found sometimes it's a little bit easier to widen the net, get the right people at the table at the beginning, and then try to dissect what it is that's going on, and then what's the best course of action. And if if not everybody agrees, it doesn't matter. I mean, there still has to be a decision being made. Otherwise, like I said, you've got everybody going off in different directions.
The article this podcast is based upon can be viewed in the best-selling cybersecurity leadership book, CISO Compass, Navigating Cybersecurity Leadership Challenges with Insights from Pioneers, available at Amazon.com and other booksellers. So I liked your story about the parenting magazine and what you were trying to do with the website, and that you had these relationships with the attorneys that you had those discussions with. Could you walk us through what the situation was and how did you get past this, trying to put this very sensitive information out on a public website?
I'll tell you another thing that didn't exist at the time. People didn't actually do their benefits online. So I'll give you a different scenario. Today, when you work for a company, it's highly likely that you're entering your benefit selection online. And so the parenting website even predates that kind of activity. So we really had the only thing we could look at, in terms of a role model, was what the banks were doing, to protect the financial data. So part of what we did is we did look at what the banks were doing. We looked at the way they designed their the DMZs, the websites, the kinds of controls. At the time, I think we had intrusion detection. So technically, we did leverage a lot of that technology. But in terms of how we actually stood up the website, we did look at the banking websites for things like user ID and password constructs. But at the same time, we because there wasn't a lot of privacy going on at the time, the lawyers, and we were global at the time as well. So the lawyers and myself and parenting, we would meet and we would talk about the consequence, of other people being able to access somebody's birthing instructions or somebody's sonogram. And we spent a lot of time thinking about, again, it come down to the 6-month rule. What would it look like if this thing were breached? And that's really how we made our decisions. We would really look at the situation, what other analysis, what information we had to work from. And then we would go through, and I'm trying to think of some functionality that we may or may not have pulled. I know we didn't put everything up that was part of the original design. And in fact, we started off in phases as well, Todd. We started off in small, and then we sort of worked our way upwards. But it was a team project. I mean, it wasn't any one person, with a loud voice that declared no, no, no. It was really about being thoughtful and using the best data that we had. And the site did launch. I think that it was a site that didn't require you to change your password. So that was where we, I think, deviated a little bit from what banks were doing at the time. I do remember we talked a lot about retention and how long we should keep the information. So we looked at everything from, standing up the website to how long did somebody really need to keep their birthing records. But it was really a teamwork, and it was a lot of discussion. And
I think a key point in there is just the 6-minute rule of or 6-month rule that you had at the time. Is how would this look after you had a breach and somebody's poring over all your emails, all the decisions, and everything that you made, and who is involved in the particular effort?
Yeah, and to a certain degree, I know now I call it the 6-minute rule, but I think it's probably more of a 6-second rule. The difference now is that I knew that when we had, would have had a breach at Time Inc., that people would have fact checked. They would have gotten the multiple sources. They would have at least done the checking. They wouldn't have just taken something and said, I heard such and such and post it right away, which I think that's what will happen today. And therefore, knowing that that's going to happen, I still think that you can be prepared for that spotlight, should that spotlight come.
So to take that little bit of a pause, and you mentioned in here too that you talked about what functions might be crossing that creepy line or moving up to that creepy line. How did you determine as to what would be viewed as creepy or not? What did you use as your guidepost for that?
We still talk about that today. When we, I still remember having these conversations recently, about, and I think the same thing is true, frankly, when you get really targeted advertising. Is that kind of creepy or not? Creepy is a little bit in the eye of the beholder, but I think, again, does it look like you kind of went a little too far? And I don't know how to define that, Todd, other than, if you get the right people in a room, they kind of, enough people will, I think, weigh in pretty solidly as to what looks like or feels like crossing a line. But I think, again, the difference there is you've got to really try to put scenarios around things, right? If you just sort of say, well, I'm going to collect that and use it for this, I mean, you've got to take the time to think about, okay, well, how could it be abused? So I think that's another key thing that I would pass on, is that I like to think about abuse cases. I know that everybody wants to think about my use case. My use case is X. I needed to do X, Y, Z, and Z. Okay. Well, if you do X, Y, Z, and Z, could I potentially abuse X, Y, Z, and Z and do something that you weren't expecting, or something that you didn't want, or something that would even cause, let me go so far as to say, a safety issue, or somebody's perception of safety, or that you're not particularly taking care of them at that moment. And so I think if you kind of play both sides of the coin and you say, how do I want it to work and how wouldn't I want it to work? That's how you can maybe think a little bit more about what's creepy or, something that's might be taken a little bit too far. And then you figure out, okay, well, can I live with it if somebody does that? And if the answer is no, I'm not going to feel good if somebody turns this thing around on me and uses it for that purpose, then you know what? Maybe you shouldn't do it.
Sure. So Renee, you talk about the risk reward and how businesses have to make that risk decision sometimes. How do you feel about the frameworks that we have today? Are they, all the different control frameworks? Are they helping us to work with the risk, or are they getting in the way of that?
I think they're helpful, but again, a framework takes time, right? So it's a little bit like backseat driving. It's like that's the rear view mirror, right? That's where we've come from to a certain degree, in my opinion. Now, it can help you to think through the future, but I'll give you a different example. For me, the biggest area or one of the biggest challenges that we face right now is the Internet of Things, right? Industrial control systems, SCADA. And we're barely, I believe, scratching the surface there. So I think there are some frameworks now, and AI is another example. Like, how do you protect that? Or what do you do with machine learning? Can machine learning help? Well, yes, it can, but or do I have other security concerns when it comes to RPAs and stuff like that? And so I do think the frameworks can help. But I also think that what I just talked about, which is thinking through what an abuse case can look like, is especially when it comes to something emerging or knowing. The other thing is what the relevance is. So when I talk about industrial control systems, I've been really passionate lately about protecting safety. And so I talked about my Reneeisms. One of the Reneeisms is there's nothing that trumps safety. So whatever feels like a safety issue, it has to be tackled. And I think that's where we're going with IoT, and we're barely scratching the surface. So I'm looking forward to better practice evolving in that particular area. And eventually, I think that will be codified into some better framework. And I do know it's emerging, Todd, but in the absence of a framework, you've still got to be able to address risk and think through it and be prepared, like I said, for that 6-minute rule.
Sure. And while we have you here, what are some of those other Reneeisms? You have my curiosity up.
One of my other Reneeisms is, there's two others that I'll talk about. One is not to permit misinformation. So if you're in a meeting and frankly, it's pretty easy to throw security under a bus, I think, especially if there's a performance issue and what have you. But if you know that that's not what's causing the problem, you need to speak up. So the minute that misinformation, is allowed to leave a room full of people, it becomes, in my opinion, gospel. And at that point in time, now you've got to try to chase down everybody that was at the meeting and try to get it corrected. Because people's perception is if you've said nothing, then it must be true. And so I put a lot of my team through training about how to have a difficult conversation so that they would not allow misinformation, bona fide, absolute misinformation to walk away. I didn't want them running into my office and saying, hey, this was said at a meeting. Can you fix it? No, it's already out there. It's already at the water cooler. The second Reneeism is, and somebody wrote me that took another job recently, and she said to me that she was laughing. It was Friday at 6 p.m. And she sent me a note. So my other Reneeism is, if you've got nothing better to do Friday at 3, or even if you do, doesn't matter, send 3 thank you notes to people that have helped you that week. Gratitude goes a long way. And so she sent me a note Friday afternoon at 6. And she said, thank you. I think of you all the time. And I believe that. I believe that that's what allows you to call favors when you need them. I believe that it goes a long way to people trusting you, to respecting you, to feeling part of your team. And so That would be Renee's rule number 2 and number 3, probably.
I think that's great advice. Before we depart here today, what other pieces of advice would you want to give around the 6-minute rule or another Reneeism?
The 6-minute rule, I end it really with, it's what allowed me to sleep at night and look myself in the mirror. And I think that's really important. Your reputation in this industry is based on your integrity, based on if people can trust you, if you live up to your commitments. And once you do that, I think, and the other thing is you have to give back, right? And you have to encourage your team. You have to be part of the industry and you have to give back. But once you do that, the thing that I'd love and why, one of the reasons I've never wanted to do anything else is this community of security people. I would trust my life with most of the people that I've worked with in my career. And I'm just really grateful that I had a chance to be part of something like this.
I think that's a great insight, and I couldn't agree with you more. It is a great community, and I think people that aren't taking advantage of the collaboration are just missing out on great opportunities to meet some great people.
Thank you, Todd. It's been an honor to get to chat with you today.
And thank you very much for your contributions to the CISO Compass book and the contributions that you've made to the industry over the years.
Thank you.
Cybereason is the champion for today's defenders, providing an endpoint security platform to prevent, detect, and respond to malicious operations on computers, mobile devices, servers, and the cloud. Cybereason. End cyber attacks from endpoints to the enterprise to everywhere. Learn more at cybereason.com/CISO stories.